The air in the crazy mountains of Montana does not just sit around you. It presses. It is a heavy ancient weight that smells of dry pine needles, pulverized granite, and a cold that seems to come from the core of the earth rather than the sky. People call this range the Crazies for a reason, and it is not just the jagged, erratic nature of the peaks that pierce the horizon like broken teeth. There is a specific kind of silence here. A silence so dense it feels like it is vibrating in the back of your skull. It is the kind of place where a man can feel his own insignificance before he even takes a single step off the trail. You look at these maps, and you see contour lines and green shading, but the maps do not tell you about the way the shadows seem to stretch and move, even when the sun is at its highest point. They do not tell you about the feeling of being watched by something that has no pulse and no name. Aaron Hedges was 38 years old when he walked into those mountains in September of 2014. He was not a novice, not some city dweller looking for a weekend thrill. He was a seasoned hunter, a man who knew the bite of the mountain air and the way the terrain could trick the eyes. He was carrying a heavy pack, a bow, and the confidence of a man who had survived the wilderness many times before. He was with two friends heading toward a high-altitude camp near Sunlight Lake. But the mountains have a way of separating the confident from their senses. On that first day, Aaron fell behind. It was a simple decision, a mundane moment of exhaustion where he told his friends he would catch up or meet them at the camp. It is the kind of decision that happens 1,000 times a year without consequence, but in the Crazies a single step out of sync can be the beginning of an erasure. The weather in early September should have been manageable, but the mountains decided to shift. A storm rolled in, turning the visibility into a grey, suffocating soup of sleet and fog. Imagine standing on a steep slope of loose shale, the wind whipping at your gear while the world around you vanishes into a monochromatic haze. You turn around once to adjust your pack, and suddenly the north you thought you knew has rotated 45 degrees. Aaron called his friends on his radio, his voice crackling through the static like dry leaves on a sidewalk. He told them he was lost, that he was hunkering down for the night, and that he would find his way in the morning. He sounded calm, perhaps a little frustrated, but there was no panic in his throat yet. He did not know that the ground beneath him was already beginning to swallow his trail. When Aaron did not arrive at the camp the next day, the mechanical gears of a search and rescue operation began to grind. This was not a small effort. We are talking about helicopters with thermal imaging, dozens of trained ground searchers, and dogs bred to catch the faintest molecules of human scent. They focused on the area between where he was last seen and the lake. They combed the ravines, the thickets of mountain mahogany, and the treacherous scree fields. But the mountains were not giving up anything. The thermal cameras saw only the cold heat of the rocks and the occasional elk moving through the timber. The dogs, usually so reliable, found nothing. It was as if Aaron Hedges had simply stepped off the face of the planet, leaving no broken branches, no scuff marks on the stones, and no scent for the hounds to follow. Days turned into weeks, and the search was eventually scaled back. The official reports began to fill with words like presumptive and unlikely survival. But then the first of the impossible clues began to surface. A year later, on the opposite side of the mountain range from where he had gone missing, a pair of boots was found. They were not just any boots. They were Aaron Hedges' boots. They were sitting near a cache of his gear, miles and miles away from his intended path. To get to that spot, Aaron would have had to traverse some of the most vertical, punishing terrain in the entire range, and he would have had to do it in the middle of a blinding storm without his boots on. Think about that for a moment. Picture the jagged rocks, the freezing slush, and the sheer cliff faces. Now imagine navigating them in your stocking feet while your mind is supposedly failing from hypothermia. It defies every law of human physiology and survival instinct. The boots were found in an area that had been searched, an area that sat near a trailhead that people frequented. They were not buried or hidden by the passage of time. They were just there as if they had been placed by a hand that wanted them to be found. The narrative of a lost hunter usually follows a predictable arc of descent into confusion, but this was different. This felt like a trail of breadcrumbs laid out by something with a cruel sense of humor. His backpack was found later, and his water bladder was empty, yet it was found only a few hundred yards from a flowing stream. The more pieces of the puzzle that were recovered, the less the picture made any sense. Why would a man strip off his most vital pieces of gear in the middle of a life-or-death situation? Why would he travel toward a high ridge instead of following the natural drainage down to the safety of the valley floor? In June of 2016, nearly 2 years after he vanished, Aaron Hedges' remains were finally discovered. They were located on a private ranch miles away from the initial search area. But here is the detail that keeps investigators awake at night. His remains were found in a spot that had been searched multiple times during the first year. The owners of the ranch had been all over that land. They had moved cattle through there, they had walked the fence lines, and they had seen nothing. Then, one afternoon, there he was. His body was lying in a position that suggested he had simply sat down and stopped. His clothes were oddly arranged, and some of his gear was missing, never to be found. The forensic analysis could not provide a clear cause of death, because the elements and the scavengers had done their work, but the location itself was the greatest mystery of all. How does a man bypass multiple search teams, thermal imaging, and local ranches for 2 years, only to appear in a place that everyone had already looked? There is a phenomenon in these cases, a recurring theme where the missing person seems to be playing a game of hide-and-seek with reality itself. We see it in the way the scent dogs lose the trail at a specific point, often near a boulder field or a body of water. We see it in the way items of clothing are found miles apart, perfectly preserved, as if they were moved by something other than the wind or animals. There is a sense of displacement, as if the individual was moved through a space that we cannot see or understand. The crazies are known for their magnetic anomalies and their sudden localized weather shifts, but those scientific explanations feel thin when you look at the sheer impossibility of Aaron Hedges' final journey. The cynical mind wants to blame it on the paradoxical undressing of hypothermia, where the brain misinterprets the freezing cold as a burning heat. But that does not explain the distance. It does not explain how a man with no boots crosses miles of mountain peaks. It does not explain the silence of the dogs. It suggests something much more predatory and much more ancient. Some speak of the mountain itself having a consciousness, a way of luring the solitary traveler into a fold in the map that does not exist for anyone else. Others whisper about entities that mirror our own form but lack our humanity, things that watch from the tree line and wait for that one moment of separation. Aaron Hedges did everything right until the moment he was alone, and in that moment the rules of the world he knew seemed to dissolve. This case is not an isolated incident. It fits a chilling pattern that stretches across the national parks and wilderness areas of North America. It is a pattern of experienced people vanishing in high-altitude areas, often near granite formations, with weather events that seem to coincide perfectly with their disappearance. When they are found, if they are found at all, they are often in locations that defy logic or have been previously searched. Their gear is scattered in ways that suggest a panicked flight or a deliberate removal by an outside force. The authorities often provide a standard answer, a bureaucratic shrug that points to the elements or animal predation, but those who look closer see the jagged edges of a mystery that does not fit into a standard police report. Take the case of Keith Parkins, a young boy who vanished from his grandfather's ranch in Nevada and was found miles away over a mountain range in a time frame that would be impossible for an adult to match. Or consider the disappearance of Jared Atadero in the Colorado mountains, where his remains were found years later, on a high ledge that searchers had already cleared. These stories are the echoes of the same terrifying scream. They remind us that the wilderness is not a park. It is not a playground, and it is certainly not empty. There are places in this world where the veil is thin, where the silence is a hunter, and where a man can walk into the trees and never truly come back, even if his bones are eventually found. Aaron Hedges' remains have been buried, but the questions about his final days remain as cold and unyielding as the peaks of the crazies themselves. The air in this office always feels heavy when the sun starts to dip below the horizon. It is a specific kind of weight. The kind that comes from staring too long at topographical maps that do not make sense, and reading witness statements that defy the laws of physics. My desk is cluttered with files that the world would rather forget. To most people, these are just names on a missing persons report. Cold statistics bound in manila folders. But to me, they are the echoes of a reality we are not supposed to see. I sit here, and I listen to the wind rattle the window pane, and I can almost hear them. The ones who walked into the green cathedrals of our national parks, and simply dissolved. Today we are going back to the crazy mountains of Montana. We are going back to the story of Aaron Hedges. A man who did everything right until the world decided to rewrite the rules beneath his feet. The crazies are not like other mountains. They sit there on the horizon like a jagged set of teeth, rising abruptly from the plains with a violence that feels personal. The locals know better than to treat them like a playground. There is a magnetic pull to that place. A literal fluctuation in the earth that sends compass needles spinning in useless circles. Pilots report instruments failing over those peaks. Hikers talk about a disorientation that hits like a physical blow. A sudden loss of north and south that leaves the brain scrambling for purchase. It was into this jagged electric landscape that Aaron Hedges stepped in September of 2014. He was 38 years old, a seasoned hunter, a man who knew how to read the land. He was not a weekend warrior looking for a scenic photograph. He was prepared. He had the gear. He had the experience. And yet none of it mattered. Imagine the scene. It is a crisp morning on September 7. The air is thin and sharp, smelling of dry grass and the coming frost. Aaron is with two friends. They are headed to a high-altitude camp near Sunlight Lake. They are seeking the quiet, the isolation that only the high country can provide. But Aaron begins to fall behind. He is struggling with the climb, his pace slowing until he tells his companions to go on ahead. He says he will meet them at the camp. It is a common enough occurrence in the mountains. A momentary separation between friends. But in that moment, the silence of the crazies closed in around him like a heavy velvet curtain. When his friends reached the camp, and the hours turned into a day and then two, they realized the mountain had taken him. The search that followed was massive. We're talking about dozens of ground searchers, dog teams, and helicopters equipped with thermal imaging. They combed the area around Sunlight Lake with a microscopic intensity. They looked under every fallen log and peered into every rock crevice. They found nothing. No footprints in the soft mud. No broken branches. No discarded wrappers. It was as if Aaron Hedges had simply stepped off the face of the planet. The bloodhounds, animals capable of tracking a scent through a hurricane, were useless. They would catch a trail for a few yards and then stop. Whimpering, circling, refusing to move forward. It is a detail that repeats in these cases with a sickening frequency. The dogs know. They sense a presence that their human handlers are blind to. They smell the wrongness in the air. It was not until the following year that the mountain began to give up its secrets, but the secrets it offered were more terrifying than the silence. In June of 2015, a search dog found a pair of boots and a camelback water bladder. They were located miles away from where Aaron was last seen, on the opposite side of a massive mountain ridge. Let that sink in for a moment. To get to that spot, Aaron would have had to traverse some of the most punishing terrain in the lower 48 states. He would have had to climb over rock fields and through dense thickets that would tear the clothes off a man's back. And he did it. Apparently, without his boots, because they were found neatly placed sitting there as if he had just stepped out of them for a moment of rest. The boots were not worn down. They were not scuffed in a way that suggested miles of desperate hiking. They were just there. And the water bladder was full. Why would a man dying of thirst in the wilderness leave his water behind? Why would he remove his primary protection against the jagged granite of the crazies? The cynical mind, the one that wants to sleep at night, points to paradoxical undressing. It is a well-documented phenomenon where hypothermia causes the brain to feel a false sensation of burning heat. The victim, in a final act of madness, strips off their clothing, even as they freeze to death. But that explanation is a thin bandage on a gaping wound. Paradoxical undressing happens in the final stages of life. It does not explain how a man then travels several more miles across mountain peaks in his stocking feet. The following year, more items were found. A backpack, a bow and arrows. Again, they were in a location that made no sense. They were found near a cache that Aaron had prepared, but he had never accessed the supplies. He was within reach of survival, and he simply turned away. Or perhaps, he was turned away. There is a sense of displacement in this case that defies logic. It is as if Aaron was moved through a space that we cannot see or understand. I have spent years looking at these patterns, and there is a recurring theme of people being found in areas that were previously searched with a fine-tooth comb. It is as if the landscape itself is fluid, shifting and changing, opening up to swallow someone, and then spitting out their remains months or years later in a spot that was once empty. When Aaron's remains were finally found in 2016, they were located on a private ranch miles from his last known position. He was found in a stand of trees far below the high ridges where his gear had been scattered. The coroner could not determine a cause of death. There was no evidence of animal predation. No broken bones that would suggest a fall. He was just gone. His life had been extinguished in the wilderness, and the mountain was finished with him. But the questions that linger are like a cold wind through the ribs. How did he travel that distance? Why did he leave his gear? And what was he running from? Or toward? In those final lonely hours, the crazies are known for their sudden, localized weather shifts. You can have a clear blue sky one minute, and a blinding whiteout the next. These storms are not just atmospheric events. They feel deliberate. Searchers often report that as soon as they get close to a discovery, the weather turns violent, forcing them back. It is as if the mountain is protecting its prize. Some speak of the mountain itself having a consciousness, a way of luring the solitary traveler into a fold in the map that does not exist for anyone else. They call it the shimmer, a moment where the air ripples like heat over asphalt, and the world you know is replaced by something ancient and hungry. I think about the silence of those dogs often. A dog does not care about bureaucratic explanations. A dog does not care about the reputation of a national park. A dog reacts to what is there. When a trained bloodhound refuses to track it, is because it has encountered something that sits outside of its predatory hierarchy. It has found a scent that spells extinction. There are things in the woods that mirror our own form but lack our humanity. They watch from the tree line. They wait for that one moment of separation when a man steps away from the fire or falls behind his friends. They are the masters of the blind spot. And once they have you, the rules of biology and physics seem to dissolve. The authorities will tell you it was a tragic accident. They will talk about the elements, the thin air, the exhaustion. They will provide a bureaucratic shrug that fits neatly into a standard police report. But they do not mention the granite. They do not mention the proximity to water. They do not mention the impossible distances traveled by people who should have been incapacitated. They ignore the jagged edges of a mystery that threatens the safety of our very reality. If we admit that a man can be moved through solid rock or transported miles across a mountain range in the blink of an eye, then we have to admit that we are not the masters of this world. We are just tenants. And the landlord is something we do not want to meet in the dark. This case is not an isolated incident. It is part of a chilling pattern that stretches across the wilderness areas of North America. It is a pattern of experienced outdoorsmen vanishing in high-altitude areas, often near massive granite formations. When they are found, if they are ever found, their gear is scattered in ways that suggest a panicked flight or a deliberate removal by an outside force. Their boots are gone. Their clothing is missing. And the locations where they are discovered defy every law of human locomotion. We are looking at a predator that does not hunt for meat. It hunts for something else. It takes the essence of a person and leaves the husk behind to baffle the living. Consider the case of Keith Parkins. In April of 1953, this young boy vanished from his grandfather's ranch in Nevada. He was only 2 years old. He was wearing nothing but a light jacket and jeans. The search began immediately, but Keith was gone. He was found 19 hours later, nearly 12 miles away. To get to that location, this 2-year-old child would have had to cross 2 mountain ranges, navigate through waist-high sagebrush, and traverse fences that an adult would struggle with. He was found face down in the snow alive, but unable to explain how he had traveled over half a mile every hour through the dark, frozen wilderness. It is an impossible journey for a grown man, let alone a toddler. The pattern is the same. The distance, the terrain, the impossible timeline. And then there is the disappearance of Jared Atadero in October of 1999. He was 3 years old, hiking with a group in the Comanche Peak wilderness of Colorado. He ran ahead just a few yards, rounded a bend in the trail, and was gone. The search was exhaustive. Hundreds of people, helicopters, infrared. Nothing was found for years. Then in 2003, his remains were found on a high, inaccessible ledge, thousands of feet above where he had vanished. The area had been searched before. The searchers who found him said it was a place no child could ever reach on their own. His clothing was found, but his shoes were missing. His little fleece jacket was turned inside out. These stories are the echoes of the same terrifying scream. They remind us that the wilderness is not a park. It is not a playground. And it is certainly not empty. There are places in this world where the veil is thin, where the silence is a hunter and the shadows have teeth. Aaron Hedges walked into one of those places. He stepped into a fold in the map, and the mountain claimed him. His bones have been buried, the case file has been closed by the sheriff's office, and the world has moved on. But the questions about his final days remain as cold and unyielding as the peaks of the crazies themselves. We like to think we are safe because we have GPS and satellite phones and Gore-Tex jackets. We think we have conquered the wild. But when you are alone in the high country, and the wind begins to howl like a human voice, you realize the truth. The wilderness does not care about your gear. It does not care about your experience. It only cares about the moment you stop looking behind you. I look at the map of the crazy mountains, and I see the spots where Aaron's gear was found. I see the lines of the ridges and the deep, dark valleys, and I see the blank spaces in between. The places where the data fails. That is where Aaron Hedges spent his last hours. In the blank spaces. In the silence between the heartbeats of the world, we may never know what he saw or what he felt as the mountain closed in around him. We only have the remnants. The boots left on the ridge, the backpack in the brush and the bones in the trees. It is a warning to all of us who venture into the trees. Respect the silence. Watch the tree line, and never ever think that you are alone. Because something out there is always watching, and it is very, very patient. The mystery of Aaron Hedges is a jagged stone in the shoe of our understanding. It refuses to be ignored. It reminds us that for all our technology and all our bravado, there are still corners of this earth that belong to something else. Something ancient. Something that does not play by our rules. As the night deepens in this office and the shadows stretch across the floor, I can feel the weight of all those missing souls. They are still out there in the granite and the pines, waiting for someone to find the truth. But the truth is a dangerous thing to hunt. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and sometimes the only thing left behind is a pair of boots sitting neatly on a ridge, miles from nowhere. The patterns do not lie, even if the authorities do. From the peaks of Montana to the forests of Oregon, from the swamps of Florida to the canyons of Arizona, the same story is being told over and over again. It is a story of sudden disappearance, impossible travel, and the silence of the dogs. It is a story that ends in a stand of trees or on a high ledge with questions that have no answers. Aaron Hedges was just one chapter in a book that is still being written. And every time someone walks into the woods and does not come back, a new page is turned. The wilderness is waiting. It is hungry. And it is much closer than you think. I will keep digging. I will keep looking at the maps and reading the reports. I will keep searching for the thread that ties all these tragedies together. Because the families deserve more than a bureaucratic shrug. They deserve to know what happened in those final moments. Even if the truth is something that our minds are not equipped to handle. Even if the truth is as cold and dark as a Montana winter. We owe it to Aaron. We owe it to Keith. We owe it to Jared. We owe it to every person who ever stepped into the trees and found themselves in a world they did not recognize. The investigation continues. The patterns remain. And the mountains. The mountains are still there, watching and waiting for the next solitary traveler to lose their way. Take the case of Stephen Kubacki, who vanished in the winter of 1978 near Lake Michigan. He went cross-country skiing and disappeared, leaving only his skis and poles in the snow. His footprints simply stopped. He was gone for 15 months before he woke up in a field in Massachusetts 700 miles away with no memory of how he got there. He was wearing different clothes. He had a map he did not recognize. He had been moved through time and space in a way that defies every scientific explanation we possess. It is the same shadow that fell over Aaron Hedges. It is the same glitch in the matrix of our reality. The veil is thin, my friends. Much thinner than we dare to admit. And once you cross over, there is no guarantee you will ever find your way back. Stay on the trail. Keep your friends close. And pray that you never hear the silence of the crazies.